Good morning. I'm Chuck McConnell from the University of Houston, and I'd like to begin our discussion today by providing some background to the Joint Low Carbon Energy Market Assessment that the Center for Houston's Future, the University of Houston Bauer College of Business, and Energy Office, and the Center for Energy Carbon Management in Energy we're presenting today. Last May, we created this unique partnership because we believe that Houston can and must be the world leader in 4 critical low-carbon energy initiatives to declare and create a call to action as the low-carbon energy capital of the world. The project mission and objectives were to understand, analyze what really that means. What would this low carbon energy capital look like? And what would be required in the 4 key areas of carbon capture, utilization, and storage, CCUS, the new hydrogen economy, a low carbon electric energy grid, and a true circular economy for plastics? You'll see a snapshot today of the past 6 months of research and the strong efforts of 12 University of Houston students. Also, in-depth symposiums will be held for each of these topic areas on consecutive Fridays this month, with virtual symposiums hosted by Energy. And the first one's tomorrow with carbon capture, utilization, and storage. Each group received expert support, and we'll recognize in each of our presentations a special recognition to the pro bono KPMG effort in the hydrogen area. My colleagues, Andy Steinhubl, Greg Bean, and Ramanan Krishnamoorti will be presenting today. And I'll begin today with the findings of the CCUS study. The 3 students on the front of this first chart, I was fortunate to be a part of and work with, and they did fantastic work, and certainly appreciate all their hard efforts throughout the time. So as we get started and begin to look at Houston as a CCUS hub, you start with the question, why CCUS? Well, the IEA and the IPCC have declared it as an essential technology to be able to meet emissions targets. We can't do that and achieve those targets with just clean energy alone. We need to continue to provide affordable and reliable, sustainable energy. And this CCUS network creates an overarching effort here in our city to enable the energy transition. It impacts the long-term sustainability of our industries today. It sets the stage for us as a decarbonization center in the United States and a globally recognized place where those skills and efforts come from. And so why Houston? Well, we're the energy capital of the world, but we need to be the sustainable energy capital of the world. We've got infrastructure and scale suitable for the cluster economics that makes this happen. And I think as a previous spokesman said, if you can't do it in Houston, you can't do it anywhere. So as we go forward, what were our objectives and findings? Well, we looked at a staged 3 by 10-year deployment. In other words, an activation phase, an expansion phase, and a broad deployment phase, looking at them in 10-year increments. And we used the National Petroleum Council construct that has recently been put out to actually look at broad commercial deployment. We analyzed not only the emissions impact, but also the economic investment impact concurrently. And we're looking at CCUS optionality in terms of our geologic formations and in terms of what we have to offer in terms of enhanced oil recovery, storage, or both. And our findings were such that the investment and risk hurdles really tell us that it will require strategic investment. It's going to require a mixture of enhanced oil recovery and pure storage in terms of our investment portfolio, but it affords us an opportunity to have a positive return at modest hurdles. And the current base of target geology and infrastructure here in Houston are far greater than our region. It impacts not only beyond into Louisiana and south and west of Houston, but also can be very important for our national program. And as such, federal, state, and local government policies will be required to support this transition. We looked at the three areas of capture, transportation, and storage. And we have challenges in all three areas, there's no doubt about it. But we also have the best position here in Houston to address all three. Carbon capture in terms of leadership in world technology development, with entrepreneurs here in town driving forward every day. Pipelines is a way of life for us down here, and we continue to look at the ways of building out our system. And of course, storage, not only for enhanced oil recovery, but storage. And we have vast reservoirs where we can be recognized globally as really unmatched in terms of the storage capacities. So as we looked at the Houston area, we looked at it in the three phases of activation, expansion, and net zero. And you see on the bottom axis, we looked at the individual processes where CO2 emissions were coming from. We looked at the low-hanging fruit in phase one. We then looked at expanding that from not only steam methane reformer, hydrogen production, and also natural gas combined cycle power plants, but got into industrial emissions and some of the other process challenges that we have, and ultimately driving to creating all of the emissions reductions in our region. But it's really not just our region, it really goes beyond that. And you'll see as we look at how we expanded these three phases in the next chart. In the activation phase, again, steam methane reformers and natural gas power plants, you see they're located very close to the existing Denbury pipeline infrastructure. The hydrogen emissions were prioritized. Steam methane reforming is a most cost-effective way of attacking emissions. Natural gas power plants are second on the list because of obviously their proximity as well. And the current Denbury pipeline is really only 1/3 capacity at this moment. So you can see we have an opportunity to activate rapidly, installing capture facilities, going after facilities that are close to existing infrastructure, and having that infrastructure be able to enable the first phase of our activities. As you see on the next chart, that Denbury pipeline extends east into Louisiana, up into Mississippi, and along with the enhanced oil recovery targets that have been identified already along that pipeline, we have a significant amount of not only EOR storage, but also saline storage. And so as we look at the ability to activate, move rapidly with capture installations, we can utilize this existing infrastructure and begin to move fast. We need to impact in terms of volumes, but also in terms of speed. The previous comment about winning slowly, this is our opportunity to win fast. And so this is why we focused on this activation phase. We then modeled the activation phase. We looked at it in terms of a 20-year cash flow analysis, in terms of looking at the NPVs and the IRRs that would come from a project such as this. We used the assumptions from the National Petroleum Council and the Gaffney-Klein work that was provided to us for the regional gas and electricity costs and the cost of capture installation. We started with a baseline of a discounted cash rate of 12% on an all equity basis as a starting point, which was what was done in the NPC study. And we looked then at a multiple series of scenarios, starting with 100% enhanced oil recovery, moving to 100% saline, and then the optionalities that were created by having a portfolio of EOR and saline. We believe that looking at it this way gives us an understanding of the fact that the returns and the investments are all part of this analysis. It's not simply just gathering up the emissions. And so from this model, we came up with some key sensitivities in terms of oil price, in terms of the oil recovery, the installed capital. And we see that the project NPV can be positive today with enhanced oil recovery applications, but it hinges on the fact that oil stays at $40 a barrel. And that's a risk. And that's part of the sensitivity analysis as well. The oil price, the recovery factor, the natural gas, CapEx, and 45Q credits that go to the project. The beauty of the model is not the answer that you get from one particular analysis, but the ability to take multiple variables, move them into this model, and create a future state and set of scenarios where investors can look at it. And that's investors throughout the value chain of capture, transportation, and the geologic areas for enhanced oil recovery. We're excited about this model because we think there'll be a lot of use for it going forward. It's not perfect, but it's certainly something that I think will set up a construct for us in our region to look at it, and also for others outside of our region to begin looking at how the geology and the natural advantages that we have in this region can be utilized, not just for the Houston economy, the state of Texas, the Gulf Coast, and really beyond that. So we've modeled a number of different other phases. Phase one, also we get into phase two where we expand beyond that initial phase one construct. We move into phase three where we, again, those three levels of capture. But I guess the point here is that as we continue to expand, we're doing it with our eye on the future, not just for Houston, but creating that infrastructure long-term to serve the greater state of Texas and the Gulf Coast. We have unmatched geologic capacity in our region. We have unmatched capabilities in our region in terms of companies that are looking to decarbonize with capacity and capability, the scale and the wherewithal to do this, and a place to attract the knowledge and the understanding for us to be viewed as a global center for CCUS deployment. Could not agree with the previous speaker more. If you can't do it in Houston, you can't do it anywhere. So we'd like to thank, again, the contributions from Jane Stricker from BP and Mike Goode from ARI and Steve Melzer out in the Permian Basin, Scott Nyquist, and also Nigel Genvy, especially from Gaffney Klein. The Gaffney Klein cost model was fundamental, and the work that was done in the NPC study really creating the construct for all of our work. So with that, let me hand it off to my colleagues, Andy Steinhubl, Greg Bean, and Ramanan Krishnamoorti, who will be presenting today. And so let me hand off to Andy and take it away.
Well, thank you very much, Chuck. Brett mentioned that today is National Hydrogen Day, and National Hydrogen Day was in fact established to raise awareness of the benefits of hydrogen. And I can't think of a better day to speak to Houston's potential to globalize our leadership in hydrogen. I'd like to recognize the students who are listed on this page who supported the case studies and modeling work, which I'll profile as part of the summary narrative, and then members of the KPMG team who also supported this work. So if I unpack a bit the notion of globalizing hydrogen leadership in Houston, the market is expected to grow for hydrogen gas about tenfold per the Hydrogen Council by 2050. And if you include equipment associated with hydrogen, fuel cells, electrolysis, the market size by 2050 is anticipated to be $2.5 trillion. And that's being driven by the fact that many countries and regions pursuing decarbonization recognize the importance of hydrogen to decarbonize activities that are beyond the limits, the practical limits of electrification. Houston has a unique opportunity to participate in that robust market growth. First of all, we bring the world's leading existing hydrogen system to the table. Steam methane reformation, pipelines, storage capacities established to support our refining and petrochemical industry on the Gulf Coast. That hydrogen could be brought to market at scale very quickly. Texas and the Houston hub also benefit from the fact we're the #1 state in wind power, have a growing pipeline of additional wind and solar, which brings a lot of low-cost power, and combined with storage gives the Houston area an opportunity to also grow a green hydrogen industry. We found 4 initiatives critical to activate this opportunity. The first 2 around the existing gray and then shortly blue hydrogen system. The initial market we'd envision as a priority is heavy trucking. That's because hydrogen competes very favorably in heavy trucking versus diesel and versus battery. We've got dense traffic corridors, I-45, I-10, and the amount of infrastructure to support a movement into that sphere is modest by comparison to other markets. To capture further benefit from hydrogen-powered heavy trucking, we'd envision, as Chuck outlined, converting our gray hydrogen to blue through CCUS, which can be expanded over time, and we're going to outline the potential to expand blue hydrogen for use in not only the Houston area, but more broadly domestically and globally. And then the last 2 initiatives are around exploiting storage opportunities and incubating the green chain. So I mentioned on the far right in the starburst, the growth in hydrogen, which is projected to be about tenfold. And that'll be for hydrogen gas alone about $1 trillion market. And in the upper right, that's being driven largely by decarbonization objectives to get to 2050 net zero. Many countries have established carbon fees or other incentives in order to drive it. There are leverageable assets in many industrialized companies, existing hydrogen systems, the potential to scale CCUS, and then opportunities to use geologic storage and low power prices. Those are all things that are different depending on the country or region. And as we'll get into in a minute, Houston has robust capabilities in each of these areas. In the lower right are technology and cost benefits that will affect all regions and all countries. So the shapes of these wedges, the gray, the blue, and the green, will all largely be regional and country specific, but the pattern of moving from gray to blue to green is fairly typical. To show you an example of that, I'd like to point out Rotterdam, which is interesting in that it's analogous to Houston in several ways. Today, it's a global refining balancing point and a refining manufacturing point. It also imports LNG, so you might think of it as a commodity hub, oil and gas commodity hub. Their ambition is to move to a hydrogen hub, a regional hydrogen hub. How are they doing it? Up in the upper left, they've got a CCUS project underway, Porthos, which is going to take their existing SMR system and convert that hydrogen from gray to blue. And it moves into that pipeline system that you see running from left to right. They also plan on incubating a green chain. Shell and BP both have wind-powered electrolysis projects on the books, and ultimately that hydrogen will also flow into that system and move throughout the Netherlands and across other portions of Europe. So the notion is pivot from commodity hub to hydrogen hub. So our project set out to customize that sort of gray to blue to green roadmap for Houston. And our approach was to look at analog studies, decarbonization strategies, regional strategies, look at projects across the value chain. Port of LA, for example, is piloting heavy trucking in the area around the port. We did economic studies around specific areas of the chain relative to Houston, heavy trucking economics, the economics of electrolysis and storage, for example. And out of that, identified how Houston might activate a broader role in hydrogen, and then how it might ultimately scale to globalize our leadership in hydrogen. So this chart, in my mind, is a bit of what's Rotterdam got that Houston doesn't have. I mentioned that Houston has a premier existing hydrogen system. We've got over 900 miles of pipelines, for example, which is over half of the pipelines in the United States. We produce 3.4 million metric tons annually, which is 8.5 times what Rotterdam produces. We have 48 plants, and we have uniquely the world's largest storage caverns along the Gulf Coast, salt dome storage caverns. And you can see the extent of that hydrogen network on the map shown on the left. You might recall the map that Chuck showed around CCUS, which falls on the eastern portion of this hydrogen network, and therefore has the potential to activate CCUS around 8 hydrogen plants early on. So if you think about how this could play out towards a 2050 vision of globalizing our leadership, the red lines are the hydrogen lines, and you can envision hydrogen not only coming out of the existing base of SMRs, but we can expand that with additional SMR, other methane-based technology. We've got access to low-cost methane. That's the yellow dotted line shown coming from the Permian on the left-hand side back over into the Gulf Coast area. We can store hydrogen, both from those blue sources and over time green. You can see the potential for green coming from our wind and solar energy in West Texas in the upper left corner, down in South Texas, down the lower left corner. And all that hydrogen could feed into an inventory in the salt caverns in the center of the page, and then feed out to a number of uses, not only in the Gulf Coast industrial area, that would be a primary target, but also transportation up the I-45 corridor, across I-10, could export into California, take advantage of the low carbon fuel standard there, and could be exported through the port through various hydrogen carrier systems to other markets, which will be short on hydrogen in light of the rapidly increasing demand around the world. So the roadmap to get there, the star on the far right, Global Hydrogen Hub. We laid out 3 phases comparable to what the CCUS team did. 2020 to 2030 being an activation phase, and you can see the 4 initiatives on the left-hand side that I highlighted earlier, a movement into heavy trucking, paralleling that with linking 8 SMR plants to CCUS. We could also incubate green hydrogen through various storage projects, and then going back to the lower portion markets, expand the movement into trucking throughout the highway corridors into other markets, and then bring hydrogen to multiple other markets over time as the green chain scales and the blue chain scales. All this will require support, appropriate support, public policy and funding programs to activate. I'd like to thank a number of industry experts who supported us along the way: Jack Farley, Steve Nave, Michael Skelly, Joe Powell, Chris Angelides, Charles Sanders, and Dave Edwards, the U of H students, and the members of the KPMG working team. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Andy. I'd now like to cover the research that was done around pathways towards a net zero electricity grid. And I'd like to present the students who did the work for Bauer College of Business students, undergraduates and graduates. And I'll be representing their work here. Next slide. This first chart is the key findings from the work. And we'll talk about each of these in a little more detail. It's important to recognize that ERCOT, which is the power grid that represents most of Texas demand, has already achieved a significant reduction in carbon intensity. And the renewable growth trends that we have mean that this is likely to continue. Going forward, we're well positioned to continue growing renewable supply, and Houston can play a leading role in this. There are three challenges that we face towards more rapid penetration of renewables in the power grid. The first is a mismatch between renewable production and load. The second is variability, both seasonal and daily. And the third is the existence of some must-run CO2 emitting generation that can crowd out renewables supply during periods of low demand. So absent energy storage, continued addition of renewables will ultimately lead to extended periods of curtailment, which dampens the returns on those renewable investments and ultimately inhibits the ultimate decarbonization of the grid. Our work is focused on how energy storage can help and can capture and store that excess renewable supply and allow the carbon-free supply to approach 90%. We also look at the additions of green hydrogen production that can provide an effective storage solution for balancing longer-term supply and demand. And finally, I think it's important for us to recognize that while the achievement of zero carbon emissions from the power grid is technically feasible, the law of diminishing returns ensures that the marginal cost to eliminate the very last few percentages of grid carbon emissions will be very high. Next slide. Texas is well positioned to expand renewables and energy storage and move towards a near zero carbon grid. We have top tier wind and solar resources. We have an independent grid in ERCOT. We have a large and well-functioning market. We have extensive infrastructure, both natural gas pipelines and transmission infrastructure, as well as several people my previous presenters have talked about. We have suitable salt storage that can be used for energy storage in the Gulf Coast and as well as East Texas and Panhandle. And Houston can really play a leading role in grid carbonization. All the large global energy players are in Houston. Many of them are pivoting to green investments. We have a concentration of major renewable energy developers and owners. We're the headquarters to many large retail power companies, and we have a highly skilled workforce and a world-class brown hydrogen infrastructure grid, as Andy referred to. Next slide. So today, we mentioned Texas has already enjoyed robust renewable growth, which has resulted in declining CO2 emissions. Over the last 10 years, renewable penetration in the Texas grid has more than doubled. And as a result, the intensity of carbon emissions from the grid has declined by 30%. And we expect that progress to continue. Renewable resources are expected to dominate ERCOT supply additions for the foreseeable future due to declining costs, improved conversion efficiencies, and other incentives. Ultimately, we can achieve with renewable additions, both wind and solar collectively, at rates comparable to the additions that we expect to be made in 2010, we expect to be able to get close to a zero carbon energy grid by 2050. Next slide. However, without storage, the benefits of renewable additions plateau. As you see on this slide, which assumes that both wind and solar additions continue at the expected 2020 levels for the next 30 years, we start to see the diminished returns in the form of increased curtailment of those resources, starting in the 2030s and moving forward. And we expect a decreased interest of investors in investing in renewable projects with projected curtailment levels getting wind projected curtailment levels get much beyond 15 to 20%. So we'll take that into account in our modeling going forward. Next slide. At the beginning, I mentioned 3 key challenges on the pathway to net zero. The first challenge is that renewable production is intermittent and varies across the time of day, months of the year, and across the years. The graph, or the figure on the right, illustrates the challenge faced over the course of a day. As you can see, renewable penetration, the renewable production varies significantly over the course of the day, the combination of wind and solar, and the periods of peak renewable production do not coincide with the periods of peak load. And as a result of that, some renewable generation needs to be curtailed, and we will require increased thermal generation to meet those peak requirements. So that's on a daily basis. Regional production patterns don't align particularly well with the ERCOT load, as we mentioned, especially wind. So we do get significant over and under supply. And third, we have a level of must-run production. Those are nuclear units, cogeneration units, minimum output from any coal assets that are online, and units that provide ancillary services. And those tend to crowd out renewables at peak times, and as a result, increase curtailment. We will talk a little bit about how we can make some adjustments to some of that must-run generation to further help decarbonize the grid. Next slide. So just a couple of points on our methodology. In terms of the key assumptions in the middle on the right, as you can see, we took the 2019 ERCOT load pattern by hour, and we grew that by 1.7% per year over the next 30 years. In addition, we added some electric vehicle demand in 2050, and that's the level of over 3 million megawatt hours in 2050. We assumed a carbon price that varies in order to keep the realized prices for renewables, particularly for solar, at a minimum of about $25 a megawatt hour, which has been the level that recent PPAs have run, and would, we believe, provide an incentive for continued investment in those resources. We do assume that today's coal-fired capacity is retired by 2050, and then we add gas generation capacity as needed. Just in terms of a couple of things that are not in the scope on the bottom left, we did not include any demand-side solutions or adjustments. We did not include any additional electrification that might result from decarbonizing other sectors beyond the electric vehicles that we mentioned. And we did not assume any increases in renewable or energy storage performance or cost. Next slide. So curtailment and renewable penetration vary with the mix of wind and solar. We're fortunate that we have both, but that mix cannot completely eliminate oversupply. In order to look at storage options to help us get close to a net zero carbon grid, we had to identify a base case that we could then look at to compare different storage options. And so what we did was, again, using the 2050 demand profile that I mentioned, we took that demand level, and after subtracting off the nuclear generation expected in 2050, we then calculated how much wind and solar generation capacity would be required in an unconstrained environment to give us a starting point. And we looked at those in terms of different balances of wind and solar that you could see on the bottom left. We looked at an all wind scenario, and that's the lowest capacity addition scenario, and that's due to the higher capacity factors of wind versus solar. And then we looked at various proportions, equal weighting, heavy wind, heavy solar, and all solar. And when we looked at the resulting renewable penetration and oversupply, we chose to go forward with our base case as the heavy wind, scenario, which you see outlined above, which results in about a 74% renewable supply after curtailment, and about 22% oversupply versus potential production. And again, this is without storage. It's a baseline for which we will do that. Next slide. And this is just a quick look at what some of the details of what that base case looks like, again, without storage. You see the significant daily occurrences of under and oversupply, which causes curtailment. In the middle, you see the seasonal imbalances where we have oversupply in most periods, especially in the spring, and then of course undersupply in the high peak demand periods of the summer. And then the graph on the right is oversupply and undersupply by hour for the over 8,000 hours during the course of 2050. And you can actually see that oversupply is larger than undersupply, and that's basically due to the must-run recovery or the must-run capacity that we have. Next slide. So now starting with that base case, we then looked at several technology solutions that would allow us to increase the renewable penetration and reduce curtailment. And we looked at several. They're listed on the left-hand side of this. First, we looked at lithium-ion batteries, and we looked at those that would have a storage duration of up to 4 hours. We looked at compressed air energy storage, which would have a potential duration of up to 48 hours. And then we looked at how we might make modifications to using hydrogen to further decarbonize the grid. We looked at converting the natural gas that's used in compressed air energy storage to green hydrogen. We looked at converting the must-run cogen to green hydrogen burning, and then looked at converting the thermal generation, the natural gas generation, to green hydrogen as well. So those are the 5 storage scenarios that you'll see on the next page. So these are the results that we had. And again, you see the first on the left-hand side, that's our base case. So that's wind and solar growing along with the projected growth in thermal generation without storage. And you can see the investment in that case is just shy of $250 billion over the 30-year period. We then look at how things change with respect to the 5 different storage scenarios. First, the lithium-ion battery scenario, where we add 30,000 megawatts of 4-hour lithium-ion battery storage. And you can see that we show the incremental cost of that, an incremental 30 plus billions of dollars, for which we get a slight increase in renewable penetration. We then, instead of adding 4-hour lithium-ion battery storage, we add 48-hour compressed air storage to that, again, limited by a total storage addition of about 30,000 megawatts, which is a perceived level at which the diminishing financial returns would likely kick in. And we see that not only is that scenario a lower cost scenario, but it also allows for a higher renewable penetration than the 4-hour lithium-ion battery case. We then look at making changes to the must-run generation capacity by using green hydrogen. Those are the 3 cases on the left. The first is converting the must-run generation to green hydrogen. The fifth bar is taking the 20 gigawatts of compressed air and replacing the natural gas burned in that with hydrogen and converting the must-run cogen to green hydrogen as well. That gets us up to about 95% renewable penetration. And then finally, if we were to convert the remaining thermal natural gas generation to running on hydrogen, we would approach 100% grid. And again, this shows the relative cost of each of those in billions of dollars over the 30-year period. Next slide. So a couple of different outcomes that we can look at on those 5 scenarios. On the top left, you could see the percentage of CO2-free renewable supply, which goes up, and those are kind of repeating the numbers that you saw on the line on the previous slide. As we go up, as we spend more money, we can get close to 100% carbon-free electricity supply, but that comes at fairly significant cost. The bottom left slide shows the necessary CO2 price. As we said, we used a CO2 price that was appropriate to support either in the non-hydrogen cases was to support a minimum acceptable realized price for the wind and solar power that was produced. And then in the more aggressive scenarios, a carbon price that would help support the production of green energy. And you could see that perhaps surprisingly, the carbon prices are not as high as you might think. They range from about $25 to about $40 a ton. And then finally, what's important to all of us as consumers is what is the demand weighted ERCOT price on the graph in the middle on the bottom. And you can see, in fact, that it varies in the lower investment, the lower renewable penetration cases, from about $35 a megawatt hour, which is pretty close to kind of average prices today, and ramps up to $40 to $45 per megawatt hour for the lower carbon supply cases. And finally, here are the roadmap. Obviously, we need to maintain the good work that's being done with respect to continuing the addition of wind and solar, maintaining tax production and incentive credits, and accelerating the expansion of ERCOT transmission capacity. An important assumption we made is that expansion of transmission capacity, which would be required, would be available. We believe the cost of that relative to the cost that we saw in terms of the additional generation capacity don't make that hurdle surmountable, but we did make the assumption that the transmission capacity would be available as we need it. And then just below, you can see the various steps in the different periods of what we need to do in terms of implementing a carbon tax or price, starting the process in 2025 to 2040 of adding storage and beginning to produce green hydrogen, and then ultimately integrating that into the remaining cogeneration and thermal capacity to get us to close to a zero time. And just acknowledging a special thanks to Apex, particularly Jack, Sarah, and Steve for all of their help with the team.
Greg, thank you so much for that wonderful talk. Chuck and Andy, you've set the stage for us to talk about why the circular plastics economy can be advantaged in Houston. I want to thank two of our students from the business school, Cameron and Will, who worked through the summer putting this work together, and my colleagues from UH Energy, Radha, as well as Alan, who really pioneered a lot of this work that I'm going to talk to you about. If you go to the next slide, the big factors around global plastic production and why it's a challenge come from the fact that since the 1950s, plastic production has been on an exponential growth. 8.5% year-over-year growth has been the average that we see since 1950 to 2015. And that, if that continues, and we look at an 8.5% growth, we are likely to see about a quadrupling of our use of plastics between now and 2050 globally. If we go with a slightly more conservative, about 4% growth, we end up at about 1,000 megatons of plastics being used. And this will result in a substantial increase in the greenhouse gas emissions worldwide, getting to about 6% of global greenhouse gases being emitted coming from plastics life cycle alone. A second big challenge with big plastic production is marine pollution. We'll talk about this in the context of Houston and why we think Houston can lead this effort in the circular plastics economy. Houston MSA dominates plastic resin production. About 50% of polypropylene, polyethylene, and polyvinyl chloride, which contribute about close to 70% of all plastics manufactured, are made in the greater Houston MSA, and that really is a huge amount of plastics being manufactured, not just for domestic consumption, but also for export. This plastics manufacturing, this resin manufacturing supports over 10,000 jobs and results in about 30 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent being put out into the environment. In addition to this steel in the ground for the making of the resins, the other big part about why Houston can lead in this circular economy is because we have some of the largest waste management and plastics recycling companies in the MSA. And perhaps differently from any other ecosystem in the country, most of the plastic waste that is generated in the greater Houston MSA comes from commercial and industrial waste producers. They contribute about 70% of all plastics waste being generated come from the commercial and industrial sector, rather than the residential sector, which dominates other areas. So if we go to the next slide, we can talk about the global circular economy and where Houston is different and where we can really find a place to make a difference in how the circular economy is going to get redefined. The fundamental way in which most of the world deals with recycling, and currently at a very low factor of what, say, 15% of all plastics being recycled, is through a process called mechanical recycling. You simply collect the plastics, you grind them up, and you repurpose them for park benches. Unfortunately, there are only so many park benches you can make out of these plastics. And so we think Houston can lead in an area called chemical recycling or advanced recycling. And this is taking these plastics back to where they started, back to fundamental molecules from which you can remake plastics back at high quality and high value products. And so that is really the focus of what we look at. And one of the differences between the global circular plastics economy and the US is there is minimal leakage of the plastic waste in the US ecosystem into the ocean or the marine environment. And that really plays a big role because we can focus on the collection, on the sorting, on the repurposing of those plastics. So if you go to the next slide, I want to talk to you a little bit about why Houston and the findings and the objectives of our work. We want to focus on two goals. The first one comes from the American Chemistry Council, which basically has put forward the notion that single-use plastics, which represent about 35 to 40% of all plastics used, need to be fully recycled by 2030, or 100% recycling by 2030, and that would eliminate a lot of the littering and the improper management of that waste. The second objective for us is to get to 100% of all plastic waste being recycled, reused, or repurposed. And these would result in a 90% reduction in greenhouse gas impact. And this is something that we believe can be achieved by 2050. One of the reasons we believe Houston has a unique advantage here is because of what I mentioned before. A lot of steel in the ground for the manufacturing of plastics resins. Workforce that is ready to take charge and build on that infrastructure. A second factor being the unique aspect of our commercial and industrial waste segments in driving the ability to recycle. And a third one, and this is what my colleagues have already alluded to, is the growth of renewable energy. If we just simply took renewable energy and used that for the manufacturing of all plastics and for all recycling purposes, we would, for the energy needs, we would immediately get a decrease of 50% of the greenhouse gas emissions that the plastics industry puts out. So we're going to talk about a couple things that are going to make a difference in terms of where Houston goes. We did a detailed study on 7 categories of plastics, different types of polyethylene, polypropylene, polyvinyl chloride, polystyrene, PET. We looked at their end uses, and the end use matters. If we go for packaging applications, that plastic goes from formation, from a monomer to pellet to waste within half a year. If I make it such that this plastic is used for foams that go into buildings, that plastic stays in the environment from the time it's made to monomer to waste over a 35-year lifespan. And so different applications have different implications in terms of what happens to the waste stream. That really drives a lot of our process. We used a detailed model at the US level and then brought it down to the Houston MSA. And we've got results to show you on the next slide that really talk about what the total plastic waste generation is going to be starting from 2000 and 2010. We've been able to validate that data. We project that today there will be about 30,000 metric tons of plastic waste being generated in the US. And by 2050, that's going to be about 10 million metric tons of plastic waste being generated. Most of that plastic waste is going to be from polyolefins, polyethylene, polypropylene, and polyvinyl chloride. And where is this plastic waste going to come from? Packaging is going to play a big role. Transportation is going to play a big role. Consumer products are going to play a big role. And perhaps most interestingly, building and construction is going to play a big role in generation of the plastic waste. When I translate this to the Houston MSA, and that is on the next slide, this slide, we are currently at about 0.6 million metric tons of plastic waste being generated in the Houston MSA. We expect that to grow by a factor of 4 over the next 30 years to about 2.4 million metric tons. The greenhouse gas impact today from cradle to grave is about 75 million metric tons for plastic being generated all the way to waste. And by 2050, we expect that to double to 154 million metric tons unless we do something about it. And this is where we've cast a scenario that allows us to come back and say, what are the options for Houston? We anticipate by addressing 100% of all single-use plastics and addressing all plastics recycling to be greater than 40% by 2030, we have the ability to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 10 million metric tons, put steel in the ground of 100 advanced recycling facilities. And these are the chemical and solvolysis-based recycling facilities that will take it back to monomer, each handling about 25,000 tons per year, with a total investment of about $3.5 billion, create 15,000 new jobs, and save over 5,000 jobs that are directly associated with plastics resin. The immediate actions that are needed are not necessarily technology. Chevron Phillips just demonstrated today that this can be done. What is a major bottleneck? The major bottleneck is improved collection and sorting. We believe that if we can replicate the extended producer responsibility agreement that is there in Europe, it can fundamentally change our ability to collect and recycle plastics waste, especially single-use plastics waste, in a much more responsible way. Education and behavioral changes are a big option and an opportunity. And lastly, identifying and building that supply chain of recycling industrial and commercial waste, I think, is a great opportunity for the greater Houston area. By 2050, we anticipate going to 100% recycling. We believe that this will result in about 135 million metric tons of greenhouse gas emissions being prevented. It will result in about 300 advanced recycling facilities and a threefold growth in mechanical recycling facilities in the greater Houston area. Our focus will be on improving recycling of things such as polypropylene, polystyrene, and linear low-density polyethylene. And this will bring in an investment of about $15 billion, create 50,000 new jobs with an annual payroll of about 1.8 billion, and save 10,000 jobs directly with the plastic resin manufacturing. One of the key action items that must be addressed is the separation and recycling of plastics such as PVC, LDPE, polypropylene, polystyrene. These have got a much higher CO2 impact and perhaps can be advantaged by something such as the carbon tax. Integration of renewables, as I mentioned, can result in a fundamental shift in the greenhouse gas impact of plastics manufacturing. And so extending PTC credit for renewables that are exclusively associated with plastics remanufacturing can be a fundamental driver for that integration process. And the last one is really an expansion of the MRFs that must happen with speed for us to be able to identify and grow. I want to pass my special thanks to colleagues at Dow, Lyondell, McKinsey, Burns and McDonnell, Avangard, FCC's, City of Houston, and HGAC for their time, effort, and energy in sort of helping us shape this report. So thank you all, and we look forward to your questions.
Well, you guys are amazing. You're right on time, and we have exactly time for one question. So Chuck, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Well, we've had a number of questions, Brett, and the one that popped up immediately that we will certainly be addressing tomorrow in our CCUS symposium is the recent NRG plant project that was closed, the CCUS facility that was paused. I will say that discussion will be robust tomorrow during our symposium. And I would also add to the person that made that comment, that project's not going away. It's a very unique position that facility creates is carbon-free electrons that are base load providing for the grid stability. So I think that's the convergence of all of the things that we've talked about. Brett, I think just in closing remarks, I'd like to thank Andy and Greg and Ram for some great presentations, as well as the Center of Houston's future staff, and in particular, those 12 students that did all the heavy lifting. Again, I'll remind you of the UH Friday Symposium series for the details and the interactive panels on each of these topics, and that'll begin tomorrow at 10 o'clock with our CCUS Symposium. It'll be every Friday throughout the rest of October. So please go and investigate that, and a lot of opportunity for Q&A with some subject matter experts. We've got over 600 people signed up for tomorrow's symposium, so please don't miss out. We're going to be back in about 5 minutes. We've got Air Liquide, BP, Calpine, CenterPoint, Microsoft, and NRG, all of them talking about facing this energy transition, the challenges of it, what they're doing, and in fact, making the future for their shareholders and for their employees. Great. So thank you.